Welcome to the Classic Audiobooks. Today, Part 4 of Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Fogg and his companions race across America, facing new dangers and unexpected delays. Will they make it home in time? Let's find out. Chapter 19, in which Passepartout takes a too great interest in his master and what comes of it. Hong Kong is an island which came into the possession of the English by the Treaty of Nanking after the War of 1842, and the colonizing genius of the English has created upon it an important city and an excellent port. The island is situated at the mouth of the Canton River and is separated by about 60 miles from the Portuguese town of Macau on the opposite coast. Hong Kong has beaten Macau in the struggle for the Chinese trade, and now the greater part of the transportation of Chinese goods finds its depot at the former place. Docks, hospitals, wharves, a Gothic cathedral, a government house, macadamized streets give to Hong Kong the appearance of a town in Kent or Surrey transferred by some strange magic to the Antipodes. Passepartout wandered with his hands in his pockets towards the Victoria port, gazing as he went at the curious palanquins and other modes of conveyance, and the groups of Chinese, Japanese, and Europeans who passed to and fro in the streets. Hong Kong seemed to him not unlike Bombay, Calcutta, and Singapore, since, like them, it betrayed everywhere the evidence of English supremacy. At the Victoria port, he found a confused mass of ships of all nations, English, French, American, and Dutch, men of war and trading vessels, Japanese and Chinese junks, sempas, tankas, and flower boats, which formed so many floating parterres. Passepartout noticed in the crowd a number of the natives who seemed very old and were dressed in yellow. On going into a barber's to get shaved, he learned that these ancient men were all at least 80 years old, at which age they are permitted to wear yellow, which is the imperial color. Passepartout, without exactly knowing why, thought this very funny. On reaching the quay where they were to embark on the Carnatic, he was not astonished to find Fix walking up and down. The detective seemed very much disturbed and disappointed. "This is bad," muttered Passepartout, "for the gentlemen of the Reform Club." He accosted Fix with a merry smile, as if he had not perceived that gentleman's chagrin. The detective had indeed good reasons to inveigh against the bad luck which pursued him. The warrant had not come. It was certainly on the way, but as certainly it could not now reach Hong Kong for several days, and this being the last English territory on Mr. Fogg's route, the robber would escape unless he could manage to detain him. "Well, Monsieur Fix," said Passepartout, "have you decided to go with us so far as America?" "Yes," returned Fix, through his set teeth. "Good!" exclaimed Passepartout, laughing heartily. "I knew you could not persuade yourself to separate from us. Come and engage your berth." They entered the steamer office and secured cabins for 4 persons. The clerk, as he gave them the tickets, informed them that, the repairs on the Carnatic having been completed, the steamer would leave that very evening and not next morning as had been announced. "That will suit my master all the better," said Passepartout. "I will go and let him know." Fix now decided to make a bold move. He resolved to tell Passepartout all. It seemed to be the only possible means of keeping Phileas Fogg several days longer at Hong Kong. Accordingly, he invited his companion into a tavern which caught his eye on the quay. On entering, they found themselves in a large room handsomely decorated, at the end of which was a large camp bed furnished with cushions. Several persons lay upon this bed in a deep sleep. At the small tables which were arranged about the room, some 30 customers were drinking English beer, porter, gin, and brandy, smoking the while long red clay pipes stuffed with little balls of opium mingled with essence of rose. From time to time, one of the smokers, overcome with the narcotic, would slip under the table, whereupon the waiters, taking him by the head and feet, carried and laid him upon the bed. The bed already supported 20 of these stupefied sots.
Fix and Passepartout saw that they were in a smoking house haunted by those wretched, cadaverous, idiotic creatures to whom the English merchants sell every year the miserable drug called opium to the amount of £1,400,000, thousands devoted to one of the most despicable vices which afflicts humanity. The Chinese government has in vain attempted to deal with the evil with stringent laws. It passed gradually from the rich, to whom it was at first exclusively reserved, to the lower classes, and then its ravages could not be arrested. Opium is smoked everywhere, at all times by men and women in the Celestial Empire. And once accustomed to it, the victims cannot dispense with it except by suffering horrible bodily contortions and agonies. A great smoker can smoke as many as 8 pipes a day, but he dies in 5 years. It was in one of these dens that Fix and Passepartout, in search of a friendly glass, found themselves. Passepartout had no money, but willingly accepted Fix's invitation in the hope of returning the obligation at some future time. They ordered 2 bottles of port, to which the Frenchman did ample justice, whilst Fix observed him with close attention. They chattered about the journey, and Passepartout was especially merry at the idea that Fix was going to continue it with them. When the bottles were empty, however, he rose to go and tell his master of the change in the time of the sailing of the Carnatic. Fix caught him by the arm and said, "Wait a moment. What for, Monsieur Fix?" "I want to have a serious talk with you." "A serious talk?" cried Passepartout, drinking up the little wine that was left in the bottom of his glass. "Well, we'll talk about it tomorrow. I haven't time now." "Stay. What I have to say concerns your master." Passepartout, at this, looked attentively at his companion. Fix's face seemed to have a singular expression. He resumed his seat. "What is it that you have to say?" Fix placed his hand on Passepartout's arm and, lowering his voice, said, "You have guessed who I am?" "Parbleu," said Passepartout, smiling. "Then I'm going to tell you everything." "Now that I know everything, my friend." "Ah, that's very good. But go on, go on. First, though, let me tell you that those gentlemen have put themselves to a useless expense." "Useless," said Fix. "You speak confidently. It's clear that you don't know how large the sum is." "Of course I do," returned Passepartout. £20,000. "55,000," answered Fix, pressing his companion's hand. "What?" cried the Frenchman. "Has Monsieur Fogg dared £55,000? Well, there's all the more reason for not losing an instant," he continued, getting up hastily.
Fix pushed Passepartout back in his chair and resumed, £55,000, and if I succeed, I get £2,000. If you'll help me, I'll let you have 500 of them. "Help you?" cried Passepartout, whose eyes were standing wide open. "Yes, help me keep Mr. Fogg here for 2 or 3 days. "Why, what are you saying? Those gentlemen are not satisfied with following my master and suspecting his honor, but they must try to put obstacles in his way. I blush for them." "What do you mean?" "I mean that it is a piece of shameful trickery. They might as well waylay Mr. Fogg and put his money in their pockets." "That's just what we count on doing." "It's a conspiracy, then," cried Passepartout, who became more and more excited as the liquor mounted in his head, for he drank without perceiving it. "A real conspiracy, and gentlemen, too! Bah!" Fix began to be puzzled. "Members of the Reform Club," continued Passepartout, "you must know, Monsieur Fix, that my master is an honest man, and that when he makes a wager, he tries to win it fairly." "But who do you think I am?" asked Fix, looking at him intently. "Parbleu, an agent of the members of the Reform Club, sent out here to interrupt my master's journey. But though I found you out some time ago, I've taken good care to say nothing about it to Mr. Fogg." "He knows nothing, then?" "Nothing," replied Passepartout, again emptying his glass. The detective passed his hand across his forehead, hesitating before he spoke again. What should he do?
Passepartout's mistake seemed sincere, but it made his design more difficult. It was evident that the servant was not the master's accomplice, as Fix had been inclined to suspect. "Well," said the detective to himself, "as he is not an accomplice, he will help me." He had no time to lose. Fogg must be detained at Hong Kong, so he resolved to make a clean breast of it. "Listen to me," said Fix abruptly. "I am not, as you think, an agent of the members of the Reform Club." "Bah!" retorted Passepartout with an air of raillery. "I am a police detective sent out here from the London office." "You, a detective?" "I will prove it. Here is my commission." Passepartout was speechless with astonishment when Fix displayed this document, the genuineness of which could not be doubted. "Mr. Fogg's wager," resumed Fix, "is only a pretext of which you and the gentlemen of the Reform are dupes. He had a motive for securing your innocent complicity." "But why?" "Listen. On the 28th of last September, a robbery of £55,000 was committed at the Bank of England by a person whose description was fortunately secured. Here is his description. It answers exactly to that of Mr. Phileas Fogg." "What nonsense!" cried Passepartout, striking the table with his fist. "My master is the most honorable man." "How can you tell? You know scarcely anything about him. You went into his service the day he came away, and he came away on a foolish pretext, without trunks, and carrying a large amount in banknotes. And yet you are bold enough to assert that he is an honest man." "Yes, yes," repeated the poor fellow mechanically. "Would you like to be arrested as his accomplice?" Passepartout, overcome by what he had heard, held his head between his hands and did not dare to look at the detective. Phileas Fogg, the savior of Aouda, that brave and generous man, a robber? And yet, how many presumptions there were against him! Passepartout essayed to reject the suspicions which forced themselves upon his mind. He did not wish to believe that his master was guilty. "Well, what do you want of me?" he said at last with an effort. "See here," replied Fix. "I have tracked Mr. Fogg to this place, but as yet I have failed to receive the warrant of arrest for which I sent to London. You must help me to keep him here in Hong Kong." "Me? But I will share with you the £2,000 reward offered by the Bank of England." "Never!" replied Passepartout, who tried to rise but fell back, exhausted in mind and body. "Mr. Fix," he stammered, "even should what you say be true, if my master is really the robber you are seeking for, which I deny, I have am in his service. I have seen his generosity and goodness, and I will never betray him, not for all the gold in the world. I come from a village where they don't eat that kind of bread." "You refuse?" "I refuse." "Consider that I have said nothing," said Fix, "and let us drink." "Yes, let us drink." Passepartout felt himself yielding more and more to the effects of the liquor. Fix, seeing that he must, at all hazards, be separated from his master, wished to entirely overcome him. Some pipes full of opium lay on the table. Fix slipped one into Passepartout's hand. He took it, put it between his lips, lit it, drew several puffs, and his head, becoming heavy under the influence of the narcotic, fell upon the table. "At last," said Fix, seeing Passepartout unconscious, "Mr. Fogg will not be informed of the Carnatic's departure, and if he is, he will have to go without this cursed Frenchman." And, after paying his bill, Fix left the tavern.
Chapter 20, in which Fix comes face to face with Phileas Fogg. While these events were passing at the opium house, Mr. Fogg, unconscious of the danger he was in of losing the steamer, was quietly escorting Aouda about the streets of the English quarter, making the necessary purchases for the long voyage before them. It was all very well for an Englishman like Mr. Fogg to make the tour of the world with a carpet bag. A lady could not be expected to travel comfortably under such conditions.
He acquitted his task with characteristic serenity and invariably replied to the remonstrances of his fair companion, who was confused by his patience and generosity. "It is in the interest of my journey, a part of my program." The purchases made, they returned to the hotel, where they dined at a sumptuously served doublet haute, after which Aouda, shaking hands with her protector in the English fashion, retired to her room for rest. Mr. Fogg absorbed himself throughout the evening in the perusal of the Times and Illustrated London News. Had he been capable of being astonished at anything, it would have been not to see his servant return at bedtime. But knowing that the steamer was not to leave for Yokohama until the next morning, he did not disturb himself about the matter. When Passepartout did not appear to answer his master's bell, Mr. Fogg, not betraying the least vexation, contented himself with taking his carpet-bag, calling Aouda, and sending for a palanquin. It was then 8 o'clock. At 9:30, it being then high tide, the Carnatic would leave the harbour. Mr. Fogg and Aouda got into the palanquin, their luggage being brought after on a wheelbarrow, and half an hour later stepped upon the quay whence they were to embark. Mr. Fogg then learned that the Carnatic had sailed the evening before. He had expected to find not only the steamer, but his domestic, and was forced to give up both. But no sign of disappointment appeared on his face, and he merely remarked to Aouda, "It is an accident, madame, nothing more." At this moment, a man, who had been observing him attentively, approached him. It was Fix, who, bowing, addressed Mr. Fogg. "Were you not, like me, sir, a passenger by the Rangoon which arrived yesterday?" "I was, sir," replied Mr. Fogg coldly, "but I have not the honour." "Pardon me, I thought I should find your servant here." "Do you know where he is, sir?" asked Aouda anxiously. "What?" responded Fix, feigning surprise. "Is he not with you?" "No," said Aouda. "He has not made his appearance since yesterday. Could he have gone on board the Carnatic without us?" "Without you, madame," answered Fix. "Excuse me, did you intend to sail in the Carnatic?" "Yes, sir." "So did I, madame, and I am excessively disappointed. The Carnatic, its repairs being completed, left Hong Kong 12 hours before the stated time without any notice being given, and we must now wait a week for another steamer." As he said a week, Fix felt his heart leap for joy. Fogg detained at Hong Kong for a week. There would be time for the warrant to arrive, and fortune at last favored the representative of the law. His horror may be imagined when he heard Mr. Fogg say, in his placid voice, "But there are other vessels besides the Carnatic, it seems to me, in the harbour of Hong Kong." And offering his arm to Aouda, he directed his steps toward the docks in search of some craft about to start. Fix, stupefied, followed. It seemed as if he were attached to Mr. Fogg by an invisible thread. Chance, however, appeared really to have abandoned the man it had hitherto served so well. For 3 hours Phileas Fogg wandered about the docks, with the determination, if necessary, to charter a vessel to carry him to Yokohama. But he could only find vessels which were loading or unloading, and which could therefore not set sail. Fix began to hope again. But Mr. Fogg, far from being discouraged, was continuing his search, resolved to not stop if he had to resort to Macao, when he was accosted by a sailor on one of the wharves. "Is your honour looking for a boat?" "Do you have a boat ready to sail?" "Yes, your honour, a pilot boat, number 43, the best in the harbour." "Does it go fast?" "Between 8 and 9 knots the hour." "Will you look at her?" "Yes." "Your honour will be satisfied with her. Is it for a sea excursion?" "No." "For a voyage?" "A voyage?" "Yes." "Will you agree to take me to Yokohama?" The sailor leaned on the railing, opened his eyes wide, and said, "Is your honour joking?" "No. I have missed the Carnatic, and I must get to Yokohama by the 14th at the latest, to take the boat for San Francisco." "I am sorry," said the sailor, "but it is impossible. I offer you £100 per day, and an additional reward of £200 if I reach Yokohama in time." "Are you in earnest?" "Very much so."
The pilot walked away a little distance and gazed out to sea, evidently struggling between the anxiety to gain a large sum and the fear of venturing so far. Fix was in mortal suspense. Mr. Fogg turned to Aouda and asked her, "You would not be afraid, would you, madam?" "Not with you, Mr. Fogg," was her answer. The pilot now returned, shuffling his hat in his hands.
"Well, pilot," said Mr. Fogg. "Well, your honor," he replied, "I could not risk myself, my men, or my little boat of scarcely 20 tons on so long a voyage at this time of year. Besides, we could not reach Yokohama in time, for it is 1,660 miles from Hong Kong." "Only 1,600, said Mr. Fogg. "It's the same thing." Fix breathed more freely. "But," added the pilot, "it might be arranged another way." Fix ceased to breathe at all. "How?" asked Mr. Fogg. "By going to Nagasaki, at the extreme south of Japan, or even to Shanghai, which is only 800 miles from here. In going to Shanghai, we should not be forced to sail wide of the Chinese coast, which would be a great advantage, as the currents run northward and would aid us." "Pilot," said Mr. Fogg, "I must take the American steamer at Yokohama, and not at Shanghai or Nagasaki." "Why not?" returned the pilot. "The San Francisco steamer does not start from Yokohama. It puts in at Yokohama and Nagasaki, but it starts from Shanghai." "You are sure of that?" "Perfectly." "And when does the boat leave Shanghai?" "On the 11th, at 7 in the evening. We have, therefore, 4 days before us, that is, 96 hours, and in that time, if we had good luck and a southwest wind and the sea was calm, we could make those 800 miles to Shanghai." "And you could go?" "In an hour, as soon as provisions could be got aboard and the sails put up." "It is a bargain. Are you the master of the boat?" "Yes, John Bunsby, master of the Tankadere." "Would you like some earnest money?" "If it would not put your honor out." "Here are £200 on account, sir," added Phileas Fogg, turning to Fix, "if you would like to take advantage." "Thanks, sir. I was about to ask the favor." "Very well. In half an hour we shall go on board." "But poor Passepartout," urged Aouda, who was much disturbed by the servant's disappearance. "I shall do all I can to find him," replied Phileas Fogg. While Fix was in a feverish, nervous state, repaired to the pilot boat at Hong Kong, the others directed their course to the police station in Hong Kong. Phileas Fogg there gave Passepartout's description and left a sum of money to be spent in the search for him. The same formalities having been gone through at the French consulate, and the palanquin having stopped at the hotel for the luggage which had been sent back there, they returned to the wharf. It was now 3 o'clock, and pilot boat number 43, with its crew on board and its provisions stored away, was ready for departure. The Tankadere was a neat little craft of 20 tons, as gracefully built as if she were a racing yacht. Her shining copper sheathing, her galvanized ironwork, her deck, white as ivory, betrayed the pride taken by John Bunsby in making her presentable. Her 2 masts leaned a trifle backward. She carried brigantine, foresail, storm jib, and standing jib, and was well rigged for running before the wind. And she seemed capable of brisk speed, which, indeed, she had already proved by gaining several prizes in pilot boat races. The crew of the Tankadere was composed of John Bunsby, the master, and 4 hardy mariners who were familiar with the Chinese seas. John Bunsby, himself, a man of 45 or thereabouts, vigorous, sunburned, with a sprightly expression of the eye, and energetic and self-reliant countenance, would have inspired confidence in the most timid. Phileas Fogg and Aouda went on board, where they found Fix already installed. Below deck was a square cabin, of which the walls bulged out in the form of cots, above a circular divan. In the center was a table, provided with a swinging lamp. The accommodation was confined but neat. "I am sorry to have nothing better to offer you," said Mr. Fogg to Fix, who bowed without responding.
The detective had a feeling akin to humiliation in profiting from the kindness of Mr. Fogg. It's certain, he thought, though rascal as he is a polite one. The sails and the English flag were hoisted at 10 minutes past 3. Mr. Fogg and Aouda, who were seated on deck, cast a last glance at the quay in the hope of espying Passepartout. Fix was not without his fears lest chance should direct the steps of the unfortunate servant whom he had so badly treated in this direction, in which case an explanation the reverse of satisfactory to the detective must have ensued. But the Frenchman did not appear, and, without doubt, was still lying under the stupefying influence of the opium. John Bunsby, master, at length gave the order to start, and the Tankardere, taking the wind under her brigantine, foresail, and standing jib, bounded briskly forward over the waves.
Chapter 21, in which the master of the Tankardere runs great risk of losing a reward of £200. This voyage of 800 miles was a perilous venture on a craft of 20 tons, and at that season of the year. The Chinese seas are usually boisterous, subject to terrible gales of wind, and especially during the equinoxes, and it was now early November. It would clearly have been to the master's advantage to carry his passengers to Yokohama, since he was paid a certain sum per day. But it would have been rash to attempt such a voyage, and it was imprudent even to attempt to reach Shanghai. But John Bunsby believed in the Tankardere, which rode on the waves like a seagull, and perhaps he was not wrong. Late in the day they passed through the capricious channels of Hong Kong, and the Tankardere, impelled by favorable winds, conducted herself admirably. "I do not need, pilot," said Phileas Fogg, when they got into the open sea, "to advise you to use all possible speed." "Trust me, Your Honor. We are carrying all the sail the wind will let us. The poles would add nothing, and are only used when we are going into port." "It's your trade, not mine, pilot, and I confide in you." Phileas Fogg, with body erect and legs wide apart, standing like a sailor, gazed without staggering at the swelling waters. The young woman who was seated aft was profoundly affected as she looked out upon the ocean, darkening now with the twilight, on which she had ventured in so frail a vessel. Above her head rustled the white sails, which seemed like great white wings. The boat, carried forward by the wind, seemed to be flying in the air. Night came. The moon was entering her first quarter, and her insufficient light would soon die out in the mist on the horizon. Clouds were rising from the east, and already overcast a part of the heavens. The pilot had hung out his lights, which was very necessary in these seas, crowded with vessels bound landward. For collisions are not uncommon occurrences, and at that speed she was going, the least shock would shatter the gallant little craft. Fix, seated in the bow, gave himself up to meditation. He kept apart from his fellow travelers, knowing Mr. Fogg's taciturn tastes. Besides, he did not quite like to talk to the man whose favors he had accepted. He was thinking, too, of the future. It seemed certain that Fogg would not stop at Yokohama, but would at once take the boat for San Francisco, and the vast extent of America would ensure him impunity and safety. Fogg's plan appeared to him the simplest in the world. Instead of sailing directly from England to the United States, like a common villain,
he had traversed 3/4 of the globe, so as to gain the American continent more surely. And there, after throwing the police off his track, he would quietly enjoy himself with the fortune stolen from the bank. But once in the United States, what should he, Fix, do? Should he abandon this man? No, 100 times no. Until he had secured his extradition, he would not lose sight of him for an hour. It was his duty, and he would fulfill it to the end. At any rate, there was one thing to be thankful for. Passepartout was not with his master, and it was above all important that the servant should never have speech with his master. Phileas Fogg was also thinking of Passepartout, who had so strangely disappeared. Looking at the matter from every point of view, it did not seem to him impossible that, by some mistake, the man might have embarked on the Carnatic at the last moment, and this was also Aouda's opinion, who regretted very much the loss of the worthy fellow to whom she owed so much. They might then find him at Yokohama, for if the Carnatic was carrying him thither, it would be easy to ascertain if he had been on board. A brisk breeze arose about 10 o'clock, but though it might have been prudent to take in a reef, the pilot, after carefully examining the heavens, let the craft remain as before. The Tankadere bore sail admirably, since she drew a great deal of water, and everything was prepared for high speed in case of a gale. Mr. Fogg and Aouda descended into the cabin at midnight, having already been preceded by Fix, who had lain down on one of the cots. The pilot and crew remained on deck all night. At sunrise the next day, which was 8th of November, the boat had made more than 100 miles. The log indicated a mean speed between 8 and 9 miles. The Tankadere still carried all sail and was accomplishing its greatest capacity of speed. If the wind held as it was, the chances would be in its favor. During the day, it kept along the coast, where the currents were favorable. The coast, irregular in profile and visible sometimes across the clearings, was at most 5 miles distant. The sea was less boisterous, since the wind came off land, a fortunate circumstance for the boat, which would suffer, owing to its small tonnage, by a heavy surge on the sea. The breeze subsided a little towards noon and set in from the southwest. The pilot put up his poles, but took them down again within 2 hours as the wind freshened up anew. Mr. Fogg and Aouda, happily unaffected by the roughness of the sea, ate with a good appetite, Fix being invited to share their repast, which he accepted with secret chagrin. To travel at this man's expense and live upon his provisions was not palatable to him. Still, he was obliged to eat, and so he ate. When the meal was over, he took Mr. Fogg apart and said, "Sir," this "sir" scorched his lips, and he had to control himself to avoid collaring this "gentleman." "Sir, you have been very kind to give me a passage on this boat, but though my means will not admit of my expending them as freely as you, I must ask to pay my share." "Let us not speak of that, sir," replied Mr. Fogg. "But if I insist—" "No, sir," repeated Mr. Fogg, in a tone that did not admit of a reply. "This enters into my general expenses." Fix, as he bowed, had a stifled feeling, and going forward, where he ensconced himself, did not open his mouth for the rest of the day. Meanwhile they were progressing famously, and John Bunsby was in high hope. He several times assured Mr. Fogg that they would reach Shanghai in time, to which that gentleman responded that he counted on it. The crew set to work in good earnest, inspired by the reward to be gained. There was not a sheet that was not tightened, not a sail that was not vigorously hoisted. Not a lurch could be charged to the man at the helm. They worked as desperately as if they were contesting in a royal yacht regatta.
By evening, the log showed that 220 miles had been accomplished from Hong Kong, and Mr. Fogg might hope that he would be able to reach Yokohama without recording any delay in his journal, in which case the many misadventures which had overtaken him since he left London would not seriously affect his journey. The Tankadere entered the Straits of Fo Kien, which separate the island of Formosa from the Chinese coast, in the small hours of the night, and crossed the Tropic of Cancer. The sea was very rough in the straits, full of eddies formed by the countercurrents, and the chopping waves broke her course, whilst it became very difficult to stand on deck. At daybreak, the wind began to blow hard again, and the heavens seemed to predict a gale. The barometer announced a speedy change, the mercury rising and falling capriciously. The sea also, in the southeast, raised long surges which indicated a tempest. The sun had set the evening before in a red mist, in the midst of the phosphorescent scintillations of the ocean. John Bunsby long examined the threatening aspect of the heavens, muttering indistinctly between his teeth. At last he said in a low voice to Mr. Fogg, "Shall I speak out to your honor?" "Of course." "Well, we are going to have a squall." "Is the wind north or south?" asked Mr. Fogg quietly. "South. Look, a typhoon is coming up." "Glad it's a typhoon from the south, for it will carry us forward." "Oh, if you take it that way," said John Bunsby, "I've nothing more to say." John Bunsby's suspicions were confirmed. At a less advanced season of the year, the typhoon, according to a famous meteorologist, would have passed away like a luminous cascade of electric flame, but in the winter equinox it was to be feared that it would burst upon them with great violence. The pilot took his precautions in advance. He reefed all sail, the pole masts were dispensed with, all hands went forward to the bows. A single triangular sail of strong canvas was hoisted as a storm jib so as to hold the wind from behind. Then they waited. John Bunsby had requested his passengers to go below, but this imprisonment in so narrow a space, with little air, and the boat bouncing in the gale, was far from pleasant. Neither Mr. Fogg, Fix, nor Aouda consented to leave the deck. The storm of rain and wind descended upon them towards 8 o'clock. With but its bit of sail, the Tankadere was lifted like a feather by a wind, an idea of whose violence can scarcely be given. To compare her speed to 4 times that of a locomotive going full steam would be below the truth. The boat scudded thus northward during the whole day, borne on by monstrous waves, preserving always, fortunately, a speed equal to theirs. 20 times she seemed almost to be submerged by these mountains of water which rose behind her, but the adroit management of the pilot saved her. The passengers were often bathed in spray, but they submitted to it philosophically. Fix cursed it, no doubt, but Aouda, with her eyes fastened upon her protector, whose coolness amazed her, showed herself worthy of him and bravely weathered the storm. As for Phileas Fogg, it seemed just as if the typhoon were a part of his program. Up to this time, the Tankadere had always held her course to the north, but towards evening, the wind, veering 3/4, bore down from the northwest. The boat, now lying in the trough of the waves, shook and rolled terribly. The sea struck her with fearful violence. At night, the tempest increased in violence. John Bunsby saw the approach of darkness and the rising of the storm with dark misgivings. He thought a while, and then asked his crew if it was not time to slacken speed. After a consultation, he approached Mr. Fogg and said, "I think, Your Honor, that we should do well to make for one of the ports on the coast."
"I think so too." "Ah," said the pilot, "but which one?" "I know of but one," returned Mr. Fogg tranquilly. "And that is Shanghai." The pilot, at first, did not seem to comprehend. He could scarcely realize so much determination and tenacity. Then he cried, "Well, yes, your honor is right, to Shanghai." So the Tankadere kept steadily on her northward track. The night was really terrible. It would be a miracle if the craft did not founder. Twice it could have been all over with her if the crew had not been constantly on the watch. Aouda was exhausted, but did not utter a complaint. More than once Mr. Fogg rushed to protect her from the violence of the waves. Day reappeared. The tempest still raged with undiminished fury, but the wind now returned to the southeast. It was a favorable change, and the Tankadere again bounded forward on this mountainous sea, though the waves crossed each other and imparted shocks and countershocks which could have crushed a craft less solidly built. From time to time, the coast was visible through the broken mist, but no vessel was in sight. The Tankadere was alone upon the sea. There were some signs of a calm at noon, and these became more distinct as the sun descended toward the horizon. The tempest had been as brief as terrific. The passengers, thoroughly exhausted, could now eat a little and take some repose. The night was comparatively quiet. Some of the sails were again hoisted, and the speed of the boat was very good. The next morning at dawn they espied the coast, and John Bunsby was able to assert that they were not 100 miles from Shanghai. 100 miles, and only one day to traverse them! That very evening Mr. Fogg was due at Shanghai if he did not wish to miss the steamer to Yokohama. Had there been no storm, during which several hours were lost, they would be at this moment within 30 miles of their destination. The wind grew decidedly calmer, and happily the sea fell with it. All sails were now hoisted, and at noon the Tankadere was within 45 miles of Shanghai. There remained yet 6 hours in which to accomplish that distance. All on board feared that it could not be done, and everyone, Phileas Fogg no doubt excepted, felt his heart beat with impatience. The boat must keep up an average of 9 miles an hour, and the wind was becoming calmer every moment. It was a capricious breeze coming from the coast, and after it passed, the sea became smooth. Still, the Tankadere was so light, and her fine sails caught the fickle zephyrs so well that, with the aid of the currents, John Bunsby found himself at 6 o'clock not more than 10 miles from the mouth of Shanghai River. Shanghai itself is situated at least 12 miles up the stream. At 7, they were still 3 miles from Shanghai. The pilot swore an angry oath. The reward of £200 was evidently on the point of escaping him. He looked at Mr. Fogg. Mr. Fogg was perfectly tranquil, and yet his whole fortune was at this moment at stake. At this moment, also, a long black funnel, crowned with wreaths of smoke, appeared on the edge of the waters. It was the American steamer, leaving for Yokohama at the appointed time. "Confound her!" cried John Bunsby, pushing back the rudder with a desperate jerk. "Signal her," said Mr. Fogg quietly. A small brass cannon stood on the forward deck of the Tankadere for making signals in the fogs. It was loaded to the muzzle, but just as the pilot was about to apply a red-hot coal to the touch-hole, Mr. Fogg said, "Hoist your flag!" The flag was run up at half-mast, and this being the signal of distress, it was hoped that the American steamer, perceiving it, would change her course a little so as to succor the pilot boat. "Fire!" said Mr. Fogg, and the booming of the little cannon resounded in the air. Chapter 22, in which Passepartout finds out that, even at the Antipodes, it is convenient to have some money in one's pocket. The Carnatic, setting sail from Hong Kong at 6:30 on the 7th of November, directed her course at full steam towards Japan. She carried a large cargo and a well-filled cabin of passengers. 2 staterooms in the rear were, however, unoccupied, those which had been engaged by Phileas Fogg. The next day, a passenger with a half-stupefied eye, staggering gait, and disordered hair was seen to emerge from the second cabin and to totter to a seat on deck. It was Passepartout, and what had happened to him was as follows. Shortly after Fix left the opium den, 2 waiters had lifted the unconscious Passepartout and had carried him to the bed reserved for the smokers. 3 hours later, pursued even in his dreams by a fixed idea, the poor fellow awoke and struggled against the stupefying influence of the narcotic. The thought of a duty unfulfilled shook off his torpor, and he hurried from the abode of drunkenness. Staggering and holding himself up by keeping against the walls, falling down and creeping up again, and irresistibly impelled by a kind of instinct, he kept crying out, "The Carnatic! The Carnatic!" The steamer lay puffing alongside the quay on the point of starting. Passepartout had but few steps to go, and, rushing upon the plank, he crossed it and fell unconscious on the deck, just as the Carnatic was moving off. Several sailors, who were evidently accustomed to this sort of scene, carried the poor Frenchman down into the second cabin, and Passepartout did not wake until they were 150 miles away from China. Thus he found himself the next morning on the deck of the Carnatic and eagerly inhaling the exhilarating sea breeze. The pure air sobered him. He began to collect his senses, which he found a difficult task, but at last he recalled the events of the evening before, Fix's revelation, and the opium house. "It is evident," he said to himself, "that I have been abominably drunk. What will Mr. Fogg say? At least I have not missed the steamer, which is the most important thing." Then, as Fix occurred to him, "As for that rascal, I hope we are well rid of him, and that he has not dared, as he proposed, to follow us on board the Carnatic. A detective on the track of Mr. Fogg, accused of robbing the Bank of England? Pshaw! Mr. Fogg is no more a robber than I am a murderer. Should he divulge Fix's real errand to his master? Would it do to tell the part the detective was playing? Would it not be better to wait until Mr. Fogg reached London again, and then impart to him that an agent of the Metropolitan Police had been following him round the world, and have a good laugh over it? No doubt. At least, it was worth considering. The first thing to do was to find Mr. Fogg and apologize for his singular behavior. Passepartout got up and proceeded, as well as he could with the rolling of the steamer, to the after-deck. He saw no one who resembled either his master or Aouda. "Good," muttered he, "Aouda has not got up yet, and Mr. Fogg has probably found some partners at whist." He descended to the salon. Mr. Fogg was not there. Passepartout had only had to ask the purser the number of his master's stateroom. The purser replied that he did not know any passenger by the name of Fogg. "I beg your pardon," said Passepartout persistently. "He is a tall gentleman, quiet, and not very talkative, and has with him a young lady." "There is no young lady on board," interrupted the purser. "Here is a list of the passengers. You may see for yourself." Passepartout scanned the list, but his master's name was not upon it. All at once an idea struck him. "Ah, am I on the Carnatic?" "Yes." "On the way to Yokohama?" "Certainly." Passepartout had for an instant feared that he was on the wrong boat, but though he was really on the Carnatic, his master was not there. He fell thunderstruck on a seat. He saw it all now. He remembered that the time of sailing had been changed, that he should have informed his master of that fact, and that he had not done so. It was his fault, then, that Mr. Fogg and Aouda had missed the steamer. Yes, but it was still the fault of the traitor who, in order to separate him from his master and detain the latter at Hong Kong, had inveigled him into getting drunk. He now saw the detective's trick, and at this moment Mr. Fogg was certainly ruined. His bet was lost, and he himself perhaps arrested and imprisoned. At this thought, Passepartout tore his hair. Ah, if Fix ever came within his reach, what a settling of accounts there would be! After his first depression, Passepartout became calmer and began to study his situation. It was certainly not an enviable one. He found himself on the way to Japan, and what should he do when he got there?
His pocket was empty. He had not a solitary shilling, not so much as a penny. His passage had fortunately been paid for in advance, and he had 5 or 6 days in which to decide upon his future course. He fell to at meals with an appetite, and ate from Mr. Fogg, Ajuda, and himself. He helped himself as generously as if Japan were a desert where nothing to eat was to be looked for. At dawn on the 13th, the Carnatic entered the port of Yokohama. This is an important port of call in the Pacific, where all the mail steamers and those carrying travelers between North America, China, Japan, and the Oriental Islands put in. It is situated in the Bay of Yedo, and at but a short distance from that second capital of the Japanese Empire, and the residence of the Tycoon, the civil emperor, before the Mikado, the spiritual emperor, absorbed his office in his own. The Carnatic anchored at the quay near the custom house, in the midst of a crowd of ships bearing the flags of all nations. Passepartout went timidly ashore on this so curious territory of the Sons of the Sun. He had nothing better to do than, taking chance for his guide, to wander aimlessly through the streets of Yokohama. He found himself at first in a thoroughly European quarter, the houses having low fronts and being adorned with verandas, beneath which he caught glimpses of neat peristyles. This quarter occupied, with its streets, squares, docks, and warehouses, all the space between the promontory of the treaty and the river. Here, as at Hong Kong and Calcutta, were mixed crowds of all races, Americans and English, Chinamen and Dutchmen, mostly merchants ready to buy or sell anything. The Frenchman felt himself as much alone among them as if he had dropped down in the midst of Hottentots. He had at least one resource, to call on the French and English consuls at Yokohama for assistance, but he shrank from telling the story of his adventures, intimately connected as it was with that of his master, and before doing so, he determined to exhaust all other means of aid. As chance did not favor him in the European quarter, he penetrated that inhabited by the native Japanese, determined, if necessary, to push on to Yedo. The Japanese quarter of Yokohama is called Benten, after the goddess of the sea, who is worshipped on the islands round about. There Passepartout beheld beautiful fir and cedar groves, sacred gates of a singular architecture, bridges half hid in the midst of bamboos and reeds, temples shaded by immense cedar trees, holy retreats where were sheltered Buddhist priests and sectaries of Confucius, and interminable streets where a perfect harvest of rose-tinted and red-cheeked children, who looked as if they had been cut out of Japanese screens, and who were playing in the midst of short-legged poodles and yellowish cats, might have been gathered. The streets were crowded with people.
Priests were passing in processions, beating their dreary tambourines. Police and custom house officers, with pointed hats encrusted with lac and carrying 2 sabers hung to their waists. Soldiers, clad in blue cotton with white stripes and bearing guns. The Mikado's guards, enveloped in silken doublets, hauberks, and coats of mail. And numbers of military folk of all ranks, for the military profession is as much respected in Japan as it is despised in China, went hither and thither in groups and pairs. Passepartout saw, too, begging friars, long-robed pilgrims, and simple civilians with their warped and jet-black hair, big heads, long busts, slender legs, short stature, and complexions varying from copper color to a dead white, but never yellow, like the Chinese, from whom the Japanese widely differ.
He did not fail to observe the curious equipages, carriages and palanquins, barrows supplied with sails, and litters made of bamboo, nor the women, whom he thought not especially handsome, who took little steps with their little feet, whereon they wore canvas shoes, straw sandals, and clogs of worked wood, and who displayed tight-looking eyes, flat chests, teeth fashionably blackened, and gowns crossed with silken scarfs tied in an enormous knot behind an ornament which the modern Parisian ladies seem to have borrowed from the dames of Japan. Passepartout wandered for several hours in the midst of this motley crowd, looking in at the windows of the rich and curious shops, the jewelry establishments glittering with quaint Japanese ornaments, the restaurants decked with streamers and banners, the tea-houses, where the odorous beverage was being drunk with sake, a liquor concocted from the fermentation of rice, and the comfortable smoking-houses, where they were puffing not opium, which is almost unknown in Japan, but a very fine, stringy tobacco. He went on till he found himself in the fields, in the midst of vast rice plantations. There he saw dazzling camellias expanding themselves, with flowers which were giving forth their last colors and perfumes, not on bushes, but on trees, and within bamboo enclosures, cherry, plum, and apple trees, which the Japanese cultivate rather for their blossoms than their fruit, and which queerly fashioned grinning scarecrows protected from the sparrows, pigeons, ravens, and other voracious birds. On the branches of the cedars were perched large eagles. Amid the foliage of the weeping willows were herons, solemnly standing on one leg, and on every hand were crows, ducks, hawks, wild birds, and a multitude of cranes, which the Japanese consider sacred, and which to their minds symbolize long life and prosperity. As he was strolling along, Passepartout espied some violets among the shrubs. "Good," said he, "I'll have some supper." But on smelling them, he found that they were odorless. No chance there, thought he. The worthy fellow had certainly taken good care to eat as hearty a breakfast as possible before leaving the Carnatic, but as he had been walking about all day, the demands of hunger were becoming importunate. He observed that the butcher's stalls contained neither mutton, goat, nor pork, and knowing also that it is a sacrilege to kill cattle, which are preserved solely for farming, he made up his mind that meat was far from plentiful in Yokohama. Nor was he mistaken. And in default of butcher's meat, he could have wished for a quarter of wild boar or deer, a partridge or some quails, some game or fish, which, with rice, the Japanese eat almost exclusively. But he found it necessary to keep up a stout heart and to postpone the meal he craved till the following morning. Night came, and Passepartout returned to the native quarter, where he wandered through the streets, lit by vari-colored lanterns, looking on at the dancers who were executing skillful steps and boundings, and the astrologers who stood in the open air with their telescopes. Then he came to the harbor, which was lit up by the resin torches of the fishermen who were fishing from their boats. The streets at last became quiet, and the patrol, the officers of which, in their splendid costumes and surrounded by their suites, Passepartout thought seemed like ambassadors, succeeded the bustling crowd. Each time a company passed, Passepartout chuckled and said to himself, "Good, another Japanese embassy departing for Europe."
Chapter 23, in which Passepartout's nose becomes outrageously long. The next morning, poor, jaded, famished Passepartout said to himself that he must get something to eat at all hazards, and the sooner he did so, the better. He might, indeed, sell his watch, but he would have starved first. Now or never, he must use the strong, if not melodious voice which nature had bestowed upon him. He knew several French and English songs and resolved to try them upon the Japanese, who must be lovers of music, since they were forever pounding on their cymbals, tam-tams, and tambourines, and could not but appreciate European talent. It was, perhaps, rather early in the morning to get up a concert, and the audience, prematurely aroused from their slumbers, might not possibly pay their entertainer with coin bearing the Mikado's faces. Passepartout, therefore, decided to wait several hours, and as he was sauntering along, it occurred to him that he would seem rather too well dressed for a wandering artist. The idea struck him to change his garments for clothes more in harmony with his project, by which he might also get a little money to satisfy the immediate cravings of hunger. The resolution taken, it remained to carry it out. It was only after a long search that Passepartout discovered a native dealer in old clothes, to whom he applied for an exchange. The man liked the European costume, and ere long Passepartout issued from his shop accoutred in an old Japanese coat and a sort of one-sided turban faded with long use. A few small pieces of silver, moreover, jingled in his pocket. "Good," he thought, "I will imagine I'm at the carnival." His first care, after being thus Japanesed, was to enter a tea-house of modest appearance, and upon half a bird and a little rice, to breakfast like a man for whom dinner was as yet a problem to be solved. "Now," thought he, when he had eaten heartily, "I can't lose my head. I can't sell this costume again for one even more Japanese. I must consider how to leave this country of the sun, of which I shall not retain the most delightful of memories, as quickly as possible." It occurred to him to visit the steamers which were about to leave for America. He would offer himself as a cook or servant in payment of his passage and meals. Once at San Francisco, he would find some means of going on. The difficulty was how to traverse the 4,700 miles of the Pacific which lay between Japan and the New World. Passepartout was not the man to let an idea go begging, and directed his steps towards the docks. But as he approached them, his project, which at first had seemed so simple, began to grow more and more formidable to his mind. What need would they have of a cook or servant on an American steamer, and what confidence would they put in him, dressed as he was? What references could he give? As he was reflecting in this wise, his eyes fell on an immense placard which a sort of clown was carrying through the streets. This placard, which was in English, read as follows: "Acrobatic Japanese Troupe, Honorable William Battlecar, Proprietor, last representations prior to their departure to the United States, of the Long Noses, under the direct patronage of the god Tingu. Great attraction." "The United States," said Passepartout. "That's just what I want." He followed the clown and soon found himself once more in the Japanese quarter. A quarter of an hour later, he stopped before a large cabin adorned with several clusters of streamers, the exterior walls of which were designed to represent, in violent colors and without perspective, a company of jugglers. This was the Honorable William Battlecar's establishment. That gentleman was a sort of Barnum, the director of a troupe of mountebanks, jugglers, clowns, acrobats, equilibrists, and gymnasts, who, according to the placard, was giving his last performances before leaving the Empire of the Sun for the States of the Union. Passepartout entered and asked for Mr. Battlecar, who straightway appeared in person.
"What do you want?" said he to Passepartout, whom he at first took for a native. "Would you like a servant, sir?" asked Passepartout. "A servant," cried Mr. Batulcar, caressing the thick gray beard which hung from his chin. "I already have 2 who are obedient and faithful, have never left me, and serve me for their nourishment. And here they are," added he, holding out his 2 robust arms, furrowed with veins as large as the strings of a bass viol. "So I can be of no use to you?" "None. The devil! I should so like to cross the Pacific with you." "Ah," said the Honorable Mr. Batulcar, "you are no more a Japanese than I am a monkey. Who are you dressed up in that way?" "A man dresses as he can." "That's true. You are a Frenchman, aren't you?" "Yes, a Parisian of Paris." "Then you ought to know how to make grimaces." "Why," replied Passepartout, a little vexed that his nationality should cause this question, "we Frenchmen know how to make grimaces, it is true, but not any better than the Americans do." "True. Well, if I can't take you as a servant, I can as a clown. You see, my friend, in France they exhibit foreign clowns, and in foreign parts French clowns." "Ah, you're pretty strong, eh? Especially after a good meal. And you can sing?" "Yes," returned Passepartout, who had formerly been wont to sing in the streets. "But can you sing standing on your head, with a top spinning on your left foot, and a saber balanced on your right?" "Humph, I think so," replied Passepartout, recalling the exercises of his younger days. "Well, that's enough," said the Honorable William Batulcar. The engagement was concluded there and then. Passepartout had at last found something to do. He was engaged to act in the celebrated Japanese troupe. It was not a very dignified position, but within a week he would be on his way to San Francisco. The performance, so noisily announced by the Honorable Mr. Batulcar, was to commence at 3 o'clock, and soon the deafening instruments of a Japanese orchestra resounded at the door. Passepartout, though he had not been able to study or rehearse a part, was designated to lend the aid of his sturdy shoulders in the great exhibition of the human pyramid, executed by the long noses of the god Tingu. This great attraction was to close the performance. Before 3 o'clock, the large shed was invaded by the spectators, comprising Europeans and natives, Chinese and Japanese, men, women, and children, who precipitated themselves upon the narrow benches and into the boxes opposite the stage. The musicians took up a position inside and were vigorously performing on their gongs, tam-tams, flutes, bones, tambourines, and immense drums. The performance was much like all acrobatic displays, but it must be confessed that the Japanese are the first equilibrists in the world. One, with a fan and some bits of paper, performed the graceful trick of the butterflies and flowers. Another traced in the air with the odorous smoke of his pipe a series of blue words which composed a compliment to the audience, while a third juggled with some lighted candles, which he extinguished successively as they passed his lips, and relit again without interrupting for an instant his juggling. Another reproduced the most singular combinations with a spinning top. In his hands, the revolving tops seemed to be animated with a life of their own in their interminable whirling. They ran over pipe stems, the edges of sabers, wires, and even hairs stretched across the stage. They turned around on the edges of large glasses, crossed bamboo ladders, dispersed into all the corners, and produced strange musical effects by the combination of their various pitches of tone. The jugglers tossed them in the air, threw them like shuttlecocks with wooden battledores, and yet they kept on spinning. They put them into their pockets and took them out still whirling as before. It is useless to describe the astonishing performances of the acrobats and gymnasts. The turning on ladders, poles, balls, barrels, etc. was executed with wonderful precision. But the principal attraction was the exhibition of the Long Noses, a show to which Europe is as yet a stranger. The Long Noses form a peculiar company under the direct patronage of the god Tingu. Attired after the fashion of the Middle Ages, they bore upon their shoulders a splendid pair of wings. But what especially distinguished them were the long noses which were fastened to their faces and the uses which they made of them. These noses were made of bamboo and were 5, 6, and even 10 feet long, some straight, others curved, some ribboned, and some having imitation warts upon them. It was upon these appendages, fixed tightly on their real noses, that they performed their gymnastic exercises. A dozen of these sectaries of Tingu lay flat on their backs, while others, dressed to represent lightning rods, came and frolicked on their noses, jumping from one to another and performing the most skillful leapings and somersaults. As a last scene, a human pyramid had been announced, in which 50 long noses were to represent the car of Juggernaut. But instead of forming a pyramid by mounting each other's shoulders, the artists were to group themselves on top of the noses. It happened that the performer who had hitherto formed the base of the car had quitted the troupe, and, as to fill this part only strength and adroitness was necessary, Passepartout had been chosen to take his place. The poor fellow really felt sad when, melancholy reminiscence of his youth, he donned his costume, adorned with vari-colored wings, and fastened to his natural feature a false nose 6 feet long. But he cheered up when he thought that this nose was winning him something to eat. He went upon the stage and took his place beside the rest who were to compose the base of the car of Juggernaut. They all stretched themselves on the floor, their noses pointing to the ceiling. A second group of artists disposed themselves on these long appendages, then a third above these, then a fourth, until a human monument reaching to the very cornices of the theater soon arose on top of the noses. This elicited loud applause, in the midst of which the orchestra was just striking up a deafening air, when the pyramid tottered, the balance was lost, one of the lower noses vanished from the pyramid, and the human monument was shattered like a castle built of cards. It was Passepartout's fault. Abandoning his position, clearing the footlights without the aid of his wings, and clambering up to the right-hand gallery, he fell at the feet of one of the spectators, crying, "Oh, my master! My master!" "You here?" "Myself." "Very well, then. Let us go to the steamer, young man." Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout passed through the lobby of the theater to the outside, where they encountered the Honorable Mr. Batulcar, furious with rage. He demanded damages for the breaking of the pyramid, and Phileas Fogg appeased him by giving him a handful of banknotes. At 6:30, the very hour of departure, Mr. Fogg, Aouda, followed by Passepartout, who in his hurry had retained his wings and nose 6 feet long, stepped upon the American steamer.
Chapter 24, during which Mr. Fogg and party cross the Pacific Ocean. What happened when the pilot boat came in sight of Shanghai will be easily guessed. The signals made by the Tankadere had been seen by the captain of the Yokohama steamer, who, espying the flag at half-mast, had directed his course towards the little craft. Phileas Fogg, after paying the stipulated price of his passage to John Busby, and rewarding that worthy with the additional sum of £550, ascended the steamer with Aouda and Fix, and they started at once for Nagasaki and Yokohama. They reached their destination on the morning of the 14th of November. Phileas Fogg lost no time in going on board the Carnatic, where he learned, to Aouda's great delight, and perhaps to his own, though he betrayed no emotion, that Passepartout, a Frenchman, had really arrived on her the day before. The San Francisco steamer was announced to leave that very evening, and it became necessary to find Passepartout, if possible, without delay. Mr. Fogg applied in vain to the French and English consuls, and, after wandering through the streets a long time, began to despair of finding his missing servant. Chance, or perhaps a kind of presentiment, at last led him into the Honorable Mr. Batulcar's theater. He certainly would not have recognized Passepartout in the eccentric mountebank's costume, but the latter, lying on his back, perceived his master in the gallery. he could not help starting, which so changed the position of his nose as to bring the pyramid pell-mell onto the stage. All this Passepartout learned from Ayua, who recounted to him what had taken place on the voyage from Hong Kong to Shanghai on the Tankadere in company with one Mr. Fix. Passepartout did not change countenance on hearing this name. He thought that the time had not yet arrived to divulge to his master what had taken place between the detective and himself. And in the account he gave of his absence, he simply excused himself for having been overtaken by drunkenness in smoking opium at a tavern in Hong Kong. Mr. Fogg heard this narrative coldly, without a word, and then furnished his man with funds necessary to obtain clothing more in harmony with his position. Within an hour, the Frenchman had cut off his nose and parted with his rings, and retained nothing about him which recalled the sectary of the god Tinju. The steamer, which was about to depart from Yokohama to San Francisco, belonged to the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, and was named the General Grant. She was a large paddle-wheel steamer of 2,500 tons, well-equipped and very fast. The massive walking beam rose and fell above the deck. At one end, a piston rod worked up and down, and at the other was a connecting rod, which, in changing the rectilinear motion to a circular one, was directly connected with the shaft of the paddles. The General Grant was rigged with 3 masts, giving a large capacity for sails, and thus materially aiding the steam power. By making 12 miles an hour, she would cross the ocean in 21 days. Phileas Fogg was therefore justified in hoping he would reach San Francisco by the 2nd of December, New York by the 11th, and London on the 20th, thus gaining several hours on the fatal date of the 21st of December.
There was a full complement of passengers on board, among them English, many Americans, a large number of coolies on their way to California, and several East Indian officers who were spending their vacation in making the tour of the world. Nothing of moment happened on the voyage. The steamer, sustained on its large paddles, rolled but little, and the Pacific almost justified its name. Mr. Fogg was as calm and taciturn as ever. His young companion felt herself more and more attached to him by other ties than gratitude. His silent but generous nature impressed her more than she thought, and it was almost unconsciously that she yielded to emotions which did not seem to have the least effect upon her protector. Aouda took the keenest interest in his plans, and became impatient at any incident which seemed likely to retard his journey. She often chatted with Passepartout, who did not fail to perceive the state of the lady's heart, and being the most faithful of domestics, he never exhausted his eulogies of Phileas Fogg's honesty, generosity, and devotion. He took pains to calm Aouda's doubts of a successful termination of the journey, telling her that the most difficult part of it had passed, that now they were beyond the fantastic countries of Japan and China, and were fairly on their way to civilized places again. A railway train from San Francisco to New York, and a transatlantic steamer from New York to Liverpool would doubtless bring them to the end of this impossible journey round the world within the period agreed upon. On the 9th day after leaving Yokohama, Phileas Fogg had traversed exactly 1/2 of the terrestrial globe. The General Grant passed on the 23rd November the 180th meridian, and was at the very antipodes of London. Mr. Fogg had, it is true, exhausted 52 of the 80 days in which he was to complete the tour, and there were only 28 left. But, though he was only halfway by the difference of meridians, he had really gone over 2/3 of the whole journey, for he had been obliged to make long circuits from London to Aden, from Aden to Bombay, from Calcutta to Singapore, and from Singapore to Yokohama.
Could he have followed without deviation the 50th parallel, which is that of London, the whole distance would only have been about 12,000 miles, whereas he would be forced by the irregular methods of locomotion to traverse 26,000, of which he had, on the 23rd November, accomplished 17,500. And now the course was a straight one, and Fix was no longer there to put obstacles in their way.
It happened also on the 23rd of November that Passepartout made a joyful discovery. It will be remembered that the obstinate fellow had insisted on keeping his famous family watch at London time and on regarding that of the countries he had passed through as quite false and unreliable. Now on this day, though he had not changed the hands, he found that his watch exactly agreed with the ship's chronometers.
His triumph was hilarious. He would have liked to know what Fix would say if he were aboard. The rogue told me a lot of stories about the meridians, the sun, and the moon. Moon indeed. Moonshine more likely. If one listened to that sort of people, a pretty sort of time one would keep. I was sure that the sun would someday regulate itself by my watch. Passepartout was ignorant that, if the face of his watch had been divided into 24 hours like the Italian clocks, he would have no reason for exultation, for the hands of his watch would then, instead of as now indicating 9 o'clock in the morning, indicate 9 o'clock in the evening, that is, the 21st hour after midnight, precisely the difference between London time and that of the 180th meridian. But if Fix had been able to explain this purely physical effect, Passepartout would not have admitted, even if he had comprehended it. Moreover, if the detective had been on board at that moment, Passepartout would have joined issue with him on a quite different subject, and in an entirely different manner. Where was Fix at that moment? He was actually on board the General Grant. On reaching Yokohama, the detective, leaving Mr. Fogg, whom he expected to meet again during the day, had repaired at once to the English consulate, where he at last found the warrant of arrest. It had followed him from Bombay, and had come by the Carnatic, on which steamer he himself was supposed to be. Fix's disappointment may be imagined when he reflected that the warrant was now useless. Mr. Fogg had left English ground, and it was now necessary to procure his extradition. Well, thought Fix after a moment of anger, my warrant is not good here, but it will be in England. The rogue evidently intends to return to his own country, thinking he has thrown the police off his track. Good! I will follow him across the Atlantic. As for the money, heaven grant there may be some left. But the fellow has already spent in traveling, rewards, trials, bail, elephants, and all sorts of charges more than £5,000. Yet, after all, the bank is rich. His course decided on, he went on board the General Grant, and was there when Mr. Fogg and Auda arrived. To his utter amazement, he recognized Passepartout despite his theatrical disguise. He quickly concealed himself in his cabin to avoid an awkward explanation, and hoped, thanks to the number of passengers, to remain unperceived by Mr. Fogg's servant. On that very day, however, he met Passepartout face to face on the forward deck. The latter, without a word, made a rush for him, grasped him by the throat, and much to the amusement of a group of Americans, who immediately began to bet on him, administered to the detective a perfect volley of blows, which proved the great superiority of French over English pugilistic skill. When Passepartout had finished, he found himself relieved and comforted. Fix got up in a somewhat rumpled condition, and, looking at his adversary, coldly said, "Have you done?" "For this time, yes." "Then let me have a word with you. But in your master's interests." Passepartout seemed to be vanquished by Fix's coolness, for he quietly followed him, and they sat down aside from the rest of the passengers. "You have given me a thrashing. Good. I expected it. Now, listen to me. Up to this time, I have been Mr. Fogg's adversary. I am now in his game." "Aha!" cried Passepartout. "You are convinced he is an honest man?" "No," replied Fix coldly. "I think him a rascal.
Shh! Don't budge, and let me speak. As long as Mr. Fogg was on English ground, it was for my interest to detain him there until my warrant of arrest arrived. I did everything I could to keep him back. I sent the Bombay priests after him, I got you intoxicated at Hong Kong, I separated you from him, and I made him miss the Yokohama steamer. Passepartout listened with closed fists. Now, resumed Fix, Mr. Fogg seems to be going back to England. Well, I will follow him there. But hereafter, I will do as much to keep obstacles out of his way as I have done up to this time to put them in his path. I've changed my game, you see, and simply because it was for my interest to change it. Your interest is the same as mine, for it is only in England that you will ascertain whether you are in the service of a criminal or an honest man. Passepartout listened very attentively, and was convinced that he spoke with entire good faith. "Are we friends?" asked the detective. "Friends? No," replied Passepartout, "but Elias, perhaps. At the least sign of treason, I'll twist your neck for you." "Agreed," said the detective quietly. 11 days later, on the 3rd of December, the General Grant entered the Bay of the Golden Gate and reached San Francisco. Mr. Fogg had neither gained nor lost a single day.
Thank you for listening to Part 4 of Around the World in 80 Days. Subscribe so you don't miss the final adventure.